Welcome everyone to episode 3 of the ESG series in APREA's Real Assets TV. My name is Parrys and I'm the Asia Real Estate ESG Associate at Blackstone and a member of the APREA ESG Committee. I'm excited to be here today discussing the topic of the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and understanding its implications, both risks and opportunities for the real assets industry. As we know, climate change presents both financial and non-financial risks to the global economy, and the TCFD was created by the Financial Stability Board to improve and increase meaningful climate-related financial disclosures through 12 recommendations structured on 4 thematic areas of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. I'll be hosting today's session, and for the discussion, I'll be joined with Cedric Lagrange, Executive Director, Head of ESG and Climate for South Asia at MSCI. Cedric has over 15 years of experience in sustainable investments across markets and assets with extensive knowledge in ESG and climate risk. Welcome, Cedric.
Welcome, Parrys. Nice to be here today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you. So to start the discussion, I'd like to begin with a broader question on the TCFD. Why do you think that it is so important and having a disclosure framework in place with significant global and cross-sector support on climate and financial risk is so important?
So I think we often hear about the alphabetical soup, the lack of standards when it comes to ESG, right? But when it comes to actually measuring and reporting on climate risk, TCFD is really becoming the global standards amongst investors, but also amongst regulators, right? It offers comparable measurements. It allows investors and regulators to speak the same language. And I think what's even more relevant, it's really because everyone speaks the same language, offer a great base to start discussing, to start innovating, to start improving all of the models that we have, right? Because I think it's very important to realize and to remember, we're at the beginning, all of us, on this climate journey.
I completely agree. And for context, could you outline the scale of climate change and the climate crisis that we're facing and how you see it impacting us globally, as well as more specifically within Asia, both today and into the future as well?
So, well, climate change is the greatest challenge faced by human globally, right? So some report mention that 2/3 of the population would be affected. The latest IPCC report back in March mentioned that actually the physical risk would be happening more frequently, in more forceful manner, more regionally in APAC. We will see the region being impacted even more, right, with just rising sea levels, heat levels, humidity levels, more frequent floodings. I think what I find quite interesting actually is the IPCC even mentions that global warmings may reduce GDP from 10 to 23%, just to give you an idea of the impact, right? If we focus again on impact, on APAC, the region will have the greater share of global emissions due to notably increased manufacturing hubs, raising income levels, and urban growth, right? And so that makes it even more urgent to curb carbon emissions and to focus on the transition, right? And again, right, to give you a bit more perspective, so we publish on a quarterly basis a net zero tracker. So as the name says on the tin, right, it basically tracks net zero progress across a universe of 10,000 companies, right? And what we notice is that close to 50% of these companies are still exceeding their budgets in order to curb global warming, right? So again, right, gives you an idea of the extent of the work ahead of us.
So you mentioned the concept of net zero just now, and it's something that we hear a lot, especially in the real estate sector, but more broadly across the economy too. I think it might be interesting and useful if you could define exactly what net zero actually means, because we hear a lot about it, but having a really strong definition sometimes isn't available. And then how are you seeing the APAC region acting towards achieving net zero targets?
Sure. So net zero means basically implementing a decarbonization pathway for a portfolio that sets a carbon emission budget to achieve a temperature scenario of 1.5 degree, right? So the idea is that we need to reduce temperature by curbing emissions. Now, what we're seeing in APAC is that there's really now a flurry of regulators that are publishing rules. So I'm based in Singapore, so you have SGX that are notably asking corporate issuers to publish climate risk metrics in their reports. The same for MS, for investors, in order to show how they are integrating and reporting on climate risk. You have similar rules in Hong Kong, in Japan. But really the common denominator in all of this is, again, TCFD, right? All of these are really referring to TCFD in order to provide these guidelines on how to do it. At the issuer level, again, right, so we're using our net zero tracker here, and we're using a tool that is called the implied temperature rise. So I call that ITR, a lot of acronyms in our industry. So if you bear with me, but basically what that tool does, so that has been designed in line with, again, with TCFD recommendations, right? In order to have a forward-looking metrics and not just to rely on carbon emissions. But the idea is to be able to track basically how issuers are aligned to a 2-degree world, right? And so using that tool, what we calculated in APAC is that the region is aligned to a 3-degree world, compared, for instance, to Europe, which is aligned with a 2.5-degree world.
That makes sense. And maybe diving a little bit deeper into net zero, and more specifically, as you were just mentioning, the concept of tracking these net zero targets. We hear companies and countries coming out with 2030, 2040, 2050 targets at both that global level and individual level. So I'd be interested to get your thoughts on how we ensure that these targets are based on verified actions and what is actually included within the targets, as opposed to, for example, other actions around using offsets, which is no longer seen as high up on the carbon hierarchy of opportunity to achieve net zero.
Yeah, so there's a lot of noise and a lot of ways, right, to measure. But so if you start from the top at the country, you can look at the national determined contribution that are basically set under the Paris Agreement and are basically the budget that each countries have under the Paris Agreement, right? So you can use that already to track and measure progress, right, at the country level. But what's great about them is that they're actually divided into sectors. So each industry sectors will have a budget. And then from there, you can then calculate basically the carbon emission budget of a company operating in that given sector and country, right? So then when we move at the company level, then unfortunately, we have to rely in disclosed data, right? So on our side, we collect the data on these 10,000 issuers. And then, so that allows us then to assess how they compare against their peers and how stringent are their targets. So to give you some examples, right? First of all, are they disclosing targets? Are the targets only including scope 1 and 2, or are they including scope 3? Do they have a timeline? Is it net zero in 2060, or are they actually a bit more ambitious? And then is it 2030? And then are they SBTI aligned, for instance?
If I could just jump in there, Cedric, too, about the SBTI. As you mentioned, there are a lot of acronyms in our sector. So the Science Based Targets Initiative is SBTI, which is a coalition of international organizations who aim to enable companies to set their own emission reduction targets, which are actually aligned to carbon science. So please continue, Cedric. I'm interested to hear more about how the scope and timeline of disclosures impact the positioning of organizations as leaders versus laggards in sectors.
So just referring back to all of these data points, because that's important, it set the stage, sorry. So we're using all of these data points as part of our implied temperature rise that I mentioned before, right? This ITR, which again, basically it's projecting the published targets of a company in the next 30 years and comparing that against their carbon emission budget, right? So like this, again, these types of tools that are now available in the market really allow investors to easily assess how issuers are aligned to a specific temperature scenario, but really, obviously, allow them to then identify the leaders and the laggards, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's part, obviously, of the engagement process that they have with corporates. Something I think that is quite important, if I can take a pause to highlight here, right, is that net zero is the goal, right? That's kind of like where we want to be. Now, how we're doing it is important, meaning that cumulative emissions really matter. The further away we are curbing emissions, the more drastic the changes will have to be, and obviously, therefore, the impact on companies' business, right? So that's one of the reasons. For instance, you've got the IPCC, but also the International Energy Agency (IEA), right? That actually calling for no new coal project to be started, because again, right, how we get to net zero is important. Now you talked about offsets, and I think that's an interesting topic. And you're right, it's kind of losing speed. So there's still a lot of interest, but there's no the challenge with offset currently is the lack of disclosure and transparency around it. I think there's really a lack in terms of certification system and mechanism, basically, that allow investors to easily compare one offset mechanism versus another, right? In terms of reporting as well, there's pros and cons. But if you look at recommendation, notably from PCAF, so another acronym, but that's basically the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Framework. And so this is a group of investors that are setting the standards now for measuring carbon emissions, right? And reporting on those. And what they're saying is that it's important to report offsets, but also avoided emissions separately. And the reason being, again, right, is the whole idea is to curb absolute emissions. That's really what we need to achieve.
That makes sense. You've just touched on the topic of reporting, and so I'd like to dive a little bit deeper into the TCFD recommendations, specifically on reporting. So the types of disclosures that we see between companies is continuing to differ significantly, from integrated reports to sections within ESG or sustainability reports, to then also having separate TCFD reports. What are you seeing as best practice reporting, as well as disclosure and transparency on the issue of climate risk?
So here again, right, there's nuances as always, but it because it always depends in where the investor is operating, because the regulator requirements may differ. It's also very dependent on the nature of the investor and the entity, right? So a bank, an insurance, an asset manager, hedge funds will have very different businesses, right? Again, so TCFD is the common denominator. All regulators are referring to those, and so that's really the standard and the guidelines, right? Now, again, in terms of to be transparent, when we're looking at the regulation and when this is being implemented, there are a lot of different ways. I guess a few investors are still looking at reporting their carbon emission baseline with some kind of indication as how they are planning to look at climate scenarios. But now the large majority are actually reporting in line with TCFD, so outlining some kind of process, some kind of strategy, reporting on how they are using some climate scenarios, and then their exposure on both transition and physical risks, right? I think another thing that is quite important, TCFD is also calling for this, but when reporting on carbon emissions, and so measuring that baseline, the common consensus is to include scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 are indirect emissions, right? And the whole idea is that you want to capture basically the full life cycle of an investment. And then final point on best practices, right? So Obviously, now a lot of investors are publishing net zero targets or indicated that they will release some soon, right? But there's also a lot more entities that are joining net zero alliances. So I think these are great because they provide a forum for discussion, but they're also pushing for standards, right, in terms of how to measure and how to report so again, right, I would recommend you to look into those. And then finally, if I keep on drilling down, right, so at the corporate level, so I picture the kind of something quite dark by saying 50% of issuers are above their carbon budget, right? But the silver lining is that transparency and disclosure is increasing. And we also see a lot more corporates that are disclosing SBTI aligned targets. So, you know, again, there's some hope.
It's moving in the right direction.
Exactly.
The only thing that I would add to all of that great commentary you made too is that in addition to the market standards and alliances, I think it's also noteworthy that mandatory TCFD reporting is also on the rise, with several countries, including, for example, New Zealand and the UK, starting to implement this. So it will be interesting to see over the next few years if, and if so, how mandatory reporting is starting to be considered more broadly across the Asia region as well.
Totally.
On to the next topic that I'd like to get your thoughts on. We regularly talk about climate risk and the downside impacts to a business for not taking action. However, one of the things that we love to talk about, and I love to talk about specifically, is that there are also opportunities for the leaders and the first movers. So would you be able to elaborate on what you're seeing in the market as the opportunities for climate leadership, such as cheaper access to debt, or more resilient and premium assets, to demonstrate the value proposition is not only downside, but also upside for leadership?
Sure, and you're right. I think it's easy to forget sometimes about the opportunities. We always think about the risk. I'm French, I always think about the glass half empty, right? But obviously, if there's risk, means there's potential losers, but potential winners, right?
Yeah.
I think the first obvious maybe opportunity is the first mover advantage. Again, right? These risks are happening. It's likely that we will evolve into a low carbon economy at some point. So the sooner you start that process, the less radical the changes will have to be, and therefore the cost, right? There's also a sign that it benefits attracting new clients. So, you know, I was reading an article recently saying that as an investor, in order to get new mandates amongst asset owners, you need to show that you are integrating climate risks. For corporates, same thing in terms of attracting capital and investors. And then obviously you want to avoid potential blow-ups, right? Yeah. What I find interesting as well, so what we see on the working with investors, right? There's a lot more focus on green revenue. So the idea of measuring and focusing on data on revenue from green activities. So if you think of energy efficiency products and services, for instance. And then we also see a lot more investors that are looking at our low carbon technology patents, because basically that allow them to kind of see how a company are setting their R&D priorities and whether they are well positioned to leverage any type of opportunities. So something that is quite interesting, right? Yeah. And something that comes up also in a conversation with a client, which I find quite interesting in the region, right? There's also a focus on access to finance for corporates, right? So a lot more banks are obviously aiming to green their books. They're under regulatory pressure as well. And so we see more and more banks increasing demand to attach some type of climate targets to financial instruments, right? And likewise, in terms of insurance, we also have heard of cases where some corporates are refused access to insurance, or at least their premium are going up, because of their exposure to climate risks and also the lack of mitigation, right? So again, right, if I summarize, the impact on the business is real, climate risks are there. There's really a push for them to be integrated by regulators, but also by investors. And TCFD is really the standard in order to do this.